Okay, it looks good. Right, let's get started. So, hello everyone. I'm Richard Acton. I'm going to talk to you today about a project I've been working on for research software sharing, publication, and distribution checklists. Um, so, I just want to sort of emphasize the importance of software to modern research, right? Basically, all modern research makes use of software in some way, and all kinds of important decisions in the clinic and in public policy are ultimately based off of results that come out of those kinds of software analyses. So, it's a very important part of the modern research process. And many projects include software as some part of the research output of the research. And this is not just limited to projects which are specifically intended to produce software outputs that are tools for other people to use, but the sort of one-off analysis scripts that are used in many, especially biological papers. Um, and uh, these scripts constitute an important part of the method section of the work, right? They're not just a sort of a part of the paper that can really be left out. They're often key pieces of the research process. And there's a quote here that I quite like that sets the context for this well, which is that an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself. It's merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete software development environment and the complete set of instructions which generated the figures. And that's a sort of a codification of a doctrine of John Claerbaugh's that Buckheit and Donohoe put out in 1995. So we've been aware of this as a problem and the approaches that we can take as a solution to it for quite some time. So I just want to start a little bit broadly. So what is reproducibility in research, and specifically in computational research? And there's a sort of narrow sense in which if you have the same data and you perform the same analysis on it, then a reproducible result is getting the exact same output from that process. But then again, you have some nuances in terminology here. So if something is replicable, then you're using the same analysis on a different data set. Or something is robust, you're using a different analysis on the same data set. Is it robust to changes in analytical methods? And then you've got generalizability, which is the ability for a result to apply beyond the initial scope of the data set and the analysis that produced it. So that's sort of the context for talking about computational reproducibility. But another concept that's quite useful is computational verifiability, which is more a question, a more conceptual view of the problem. So it's not merely the ability to get out the exact result that you put in, but rather to understand what the computation is doing and to be able to check that the computation corresponds to whatever your actual sort of intellectual or conceptual model of the problem space is. Does the computer system actually reflect the system that you are trying to study? So reproducibility is kind of a prerequisite in many ways for verifiability, right? And there are various things that you need in order for a computation to be reproducible and ideally verifiable as well. A verifiable can be a tall task in a very complicated software system because it implies understanding of the various steps. So inspectability is a very important part of this, which is the ability to actually see and understand the source code, to be able to view all the steps involved to check that the logic corresponds to what you're actually expecting the result to be. And then you have executability, which is, of course, the ability to run that code on a suitable computer to verify that the outputs correspond. And explorability, which is another one which I think is a little underappreciated, which is the possibility to go into a piece of code kind of mid-flow and change stuff and see what happens. The ability to do that is very useful for assaying the correctness of methods, for trying out different statistical methods, for being able to see what the effect of changing things is, also for debugging code. So it's making it available in a way that it's not just narrowly a black box of reproducibility, one thing on the end, one thing out the other, but the ability to go around in there and play with bits of it, which it's important for iterating on methods. And then lastly, confirmability, or the ability to check that the source code and the executed version of the code actually correspond to one another. So is the code that produced the output, is the source code actually the same as the executed binary code that produced that output? So documenting all of these elements, right, having a full picture of the software environment in a modern software system is quite challenging. There's tools that can help out with this. Many of them are only partial solutions to the problem. So take, for example, the R interpreter, common statistical language R. As of version 4.1.1, that interpreter, so the core R language that you give R code to that turns it into executable code, is requires like 304 separate binaries, and the dependency graph, when you map out the entire thing, has 935 edges. So even before you've added any R packages, you have a complex dependency tree for a core piece of software that you're using for all the other stuff. So once you recurse all the way back through the transitive dependencies, there's a lot of stuff to describe to have a complete picture of your computational environment. And there's some good tooling which makes it more possible to do this now than it has been previously. But so that's a little bit of what reproducible computation is. Let's talk a little bit now about sort of why it matters. So it allows us to focus on the biological and analytical sources of variation, not technical ones, right? If the code is exactly reproducible, we can rule out the code as a source of error, as it were, right? So we don't have to go looking for bugs in the code. And if we are going to go look for source of bugs in the code, then we need the transparency, so that if it is a technical problem, then we can see where that technical problem originated, track it down, and figure out what went wrong. And of course, a practical point of trying to avoid the problem of dependency hell and worked on my machine problems. Right? If you have a good, complete description of your compute environment, it should be possible for someone else to install it on their machine and then to get the same result without having to go through a lot of work to do that, which is often not the case. So I'm going to carry on with a few examples and case studies of instances where this hasn't gone well, to sort of send home the point of why it matters that we pay attention to it. So this was a fun little case study so there was a glitch in some scripts that were published for calculating nuclear magnetic resonance chemical shifts. From a paper that was published in Nature Protocols back in 2014, and it was cited over 130 times before this glitch was actually discovered. It's a very minor one. It's a sort of subtle bug. It's a platform-dependent bug. It happens that if you run this script on Windows, then it gets the files in the right order. So there's two files that pertain to the same thing, and it just assumes that when you read them into this Python script, they will be in the same order in both cases, and then compare them up based on the order in which they're read. However, if you run this on a Linux system, or I think probably also a Mac system, the order is scrambled. So the pairing is not valid. And what you get out is a sensible looking result, but unfortunately, it is a different and incorrect result. So this is one of the most difficult and annoying types of bug, in that it produces what looks like a sane output, but it's actually just incorrect. So lots of simple errors end up in the literature and can change things quite substantially. This was one where we had quite an interesting little case study. So some researchers, Keith Bagley and Kevin Coombs, did a bit of a forensic exercise on a paper. They went through and tried to figure out some inconsistencies that they'd spotted in the outcome, and they found that some group labels had been swapped. This paper was trying to predict chemical sensitivity of using cell expression data in cell lines. So they had gene expression profiles from these different cell lines. They treated them with various drugs, and then they attempted to predict what the response would be based on the response of these cell lines to the drugs. And they were using this prediction to assign people to different wings of a clinical trial. So various errors in the computational steps of this paper. There was an off by one error that meant a bunch of the gene lists that were presented were actually just one gene off from the actual gene that they were on. They had this label switching error, so they switched around the groups of the cell lines that were sensitive versus the cell lines that were resistant to the chemicals. And they had a number of instances where supposedly distinct samples actually had identical data in their data labeling. So clearly some bugs in there. Quick fire round of a few more examples. 5 papers were retracted after a bug in a script for processing protein structures flipped a couple of columns around. So you ended up with like an inverted version of the protein structure. There was a paper retracted after treatment groups for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease intervention were swapped. So the finding said the intervention, there were fewer hospitalizations in this new intervention, when in fact there were more hospitalizations in this new intervention, at least according to the initial analysis. As it turned out, once they did a more thorough look through the results, fortunately, they found another error, which meant that the imputation of missing values had been done slightly incorrectly. So the result was no longer significant. So at least this intervention wasn't actually doing additional harm, but it appeared to be, at least on the initial error that they spotted in the paper. And then, of course, you have things that have unusually large scopes. So there was a very politically influential paper that was used to justify a bunch of the austerity-based spending policies after the 2008 crash that turned out to have an error in an Excel spreadsheet where they unintentionally excluded a bunch of columns, including several major economies from the analysis. And this and a couple of other errors I won't get into meant that a key conclusion of the paper that public sector debt to GDP ratios above 90%, countries with that debt to GDP ratio had an average of 2.2% real annual growth, not negative 0.1 as the published result suggested. So there's lots of results where relatively minor software errors have quite consequential results. So what is it that we can do about that is something we'll be getting onto. So those are some nice anecdotal examples. Here's a more systematic look at the current picture from some good, more quantitative survey studies that have been carried out. So in 2019, there was this nice study of a bunch of papers in the area of hydrology and water resources. And they found that approximately 1.1% of the sample of papers that they were looking at had what they would think of as sort of full reproducibility, according to their survey that structured their analysis of the papers. And this was from a sample of papers that were already kind of expected to have a pretty good computational reproducibility rate. So of the papers that they covered, approximately 5.6% of them had made their code and data available, but only a fifth of those ended up actually being fully reproducible. So even those supposedly doing it the right way had some issues of actually being computationally reproducible. Similarly, there was a study in Science of papers in the journal Science that had not that dissimilar estimate of full reproducibility rates, about 2%, so 4 in the 204 papers they looked at. And this one sort of good sign from this was that there was a substantially higher rate of the ability to get to the level of full reproducibility once you had code and data from authors. So in this study, they went back to the authors and they said, can you give us some additional information? When that information was provided, they got a higher rate. So extrapolating from the subset that they requested additional data from, they reckon it might get up to about as high as 25%, 26% fully reproducible if all that information was available. So there's a bit of a gap, right? There's an opportunity there to get those computational reproducibility rates up if people are actually providing the information and presenting it in a fashion that makes it easier for others to reproduce their work. Interestingly, there was a little bit of an indication that journal policies that were kind of voluntary but not particularly well specified, or journal policies rather that were voluntary but well specified, were actually better adhered to than vague ones that were mandatory. So there's an indication that having good guidance, even if it's not enforced strongly, might still have an effect on uptake. So one of the things that kind of kicked off this project for me was I was looking at writing recommendations for researchers for sharing various types of data. And I encountered this community developed set of checklists for publishing images and image analyses that the QuarApp Limia community had put out. And they seem to have had a fair amount of success with this. So I thought perhaps we can apply something similar to the area of research software outputs. And this project came out of that. And increasingly, they've got adoption of, if not their checklists per se, but an item added to other research output checklists that are already existing in some of the journals. So there's a request to do some data deposition coming from several major journals. So one of the things that I obviously started out with was what resources already exist in this space, what can we use to start this off? And there's quite a few. However, most of them are directed towards people who are producing software packages, which is, it's a useful factor, but there's several different types of software output. And I think it's helpful to have advice which is tailored to the different types of output. Specifically, there was definitely a gap when it came to your sort of one-off analyses for research papers. They're very focused on sort of research software development professionals as their audience, and not necessarily the general researcher who's doing programming as a part of their work. One of the other aspects of them I thought was a bit missing is they're not necessarily terribly aspirational in the sense that, they give you a floor. This is the stuff that you should do, but there are various ways in which you can kind of go above and beyond the minimum that might be useful for a specific project. So presenting the options for, okay, if you have a specific scenario where you really need to be better in this dimension, then what can you do that's sort of above that? And also, they're not necessarily presented in the most accessible fashion for researchers. So unless you have your slightly unusual reading tastes like me, going through software management plan documentation in these lengthy PDFs, researchers have got enough lengthy, boring PDFs to read. So going out and seeking more is not necessarily on the agenda. So I wanted a way of structuring these so they might be a little bit more approachable. So this is perhaps the most important slide in the presentation. This is the overview of the checklists. So their target audience is for anyone who's developing software which might be resulting in an output which is used by researchers or researchers themselves, including people making web services for researchers. And to split this up, I've divided the sort of types of research software output into 4 general categories. Within a little bit of a taxonomy. So you've got your generic tools, which is your sort of unitary software packages, a conventional software library, an individual thing which does a particular task. And then you've got multi-part workflows or pipelines. So you have a bioinformatic analysis that performs, say, the pre-processing for RNA sequencing, something which is relatively standardized, but which consists of many individual pieces of software working in concert. Then you have your web-based service, like a database or an application that is accessed by researchers over the internet, but not necessarily run on their local systems. And lastly, the record of a specific analysis or research compendium, the one-off scripts for a particular paper. So the sort of approach I've taken is to think about some generic areas and frame them in terms of motivating questions that would apply across all these categories, and then make specific suggestions that differ for each of those categories, but within the same broad themes. So the generic areas that I've picked up on and sort of spelled out here are firstly source control or version control. So how can you keep a track history of your project, what changes you've made and how you can collaborate on it. Then you've got licensing. So on what terms are other people able to use your code, and how can you communicate those terms to others? Documentation. How do people know what your project is, how to use it, and how to contribute to it potentially? Making the work citable. So how can people reference your software and give you credit for your work? Testing. So how can the software be tested so that you could be confident that it does what you think it does? Automation, various forms of automation can be used to increase the consistency and reduce manual work in things like testing. Peer review or code review, how can you get a third-party endorsement and expert feedback for your project? Distribution, so how can people install and access the software that's emerging from your project? And environment management and portability, how do people get specific versions of the software installed on their system to make sure that it actually will run no matter where it is that you're running it. Energy efficiency, that's most important, I suppose, for large bioinformatic pipelines. How can you minimize the wasted energy or minimize the unnecessary intermediate files and so on that would then go on to be archived for a long time and cost money to do so. And lastly, governance, conduct, and continuity. So how can you, be excellent to each other, make good decisions as a project, and ensure that the project can continue to be operated. And then within each of those broad areas, I've got different tiers at which you can tick those items off the list. So, you get a bronze badge for source control if you meet a particular set of criteria for a generic tool or for a web-based service. So that's the sort of a big picture summary of the checklists. And the last bit is the format of the checklists is such that they're a simple markdown text file with some expandable details sections that go on to provide some information about how you might be able to tick off the particular item on the checklist. And that makes it so that you can include these checklists into your project under source control, like in a Git repository, for example, from the beginning of the project and tick off the items as you go. So they're sort of there, they're accessible, you can make progress through them, and you're not sort of having to refer out to some other piece of documentation. So nicely integrated is the idea, to make it approachable and something you can deal with incrementally throughout the lifetime of your project, as opposed to thinking about it right at the end. That's the idea, is to encourage its adoption early on in the history of a project. If you want to learn more about these checklists, there's a website for them, rsspdc.org. If you want to follow along with the slides, there's a link to the slides there as well. Yeah, so that's just if you're wanting to follow along with a look at what the actual checklists look like while I'm talking through the rest of this. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus a little bit on what the checklists look like for one of those categories, specifically the record of specific analysis or research compendium category. So this is, considerations for sharing code which is associated with a sort of specific published result in the academic literature. Yeah, so this is the source control category. So how to keep track of the history of the project. So you've got your Git history, which I think in a computational project is something you should very much think of as the lab notebook for your computational project. It gives you a temporal sequence to your changes because you have a history of those changes, which is something you don't get in an ordinary file. The file just has a latest version of it. If you have a Git history, you have an order in which things were done and changes were made to your project. And there's various different sort of qualities of Git history that you can have. Right, Git is a tool not just for version control per se, but for authoring an account of the history of the project. Right, it's creating good snapshots of this is a relevant time in the history of the project at which to have a snapshot of the history. This was this build of the code and so on. So it's a useful tool to have, but it also has a bunch of advantages for integration with various other kinds of automations. Git hosting services have all kinds of useful things you can do to run automated tests, build websites based on the code, host documentation, and so on, as well as being an excellent way to collaborate in a distributed fashion with the authors of not just code, but text in general can be quite effectively authored through Git. So this is what that checklist looks like. These are the actual sort of boxes that you tick. There would be an expandable detailed section here just below, so that there's some advice about what each of these means and additional resources. But if you're just using version control, but there's a couple of commits because you just added it to Git, then you can tick off the bronze one. If you've got a longer project history where you've got some sensible commit messages about why you made these changes to your code base, then you can tick it off at the silver tier. And once you get into the gold tier, then we're sort of you might not necessarily need this for smaller scale projects, but a lot of them you may start adopting particular conventions for how you style your commits. That's moving into the platinum tier. There's a whole standard called conventional commits about sort of ways in which you can organize your commit messages so that they can be automatically searched through. You can apply certain filtering rules so you can spot different kinds of changes. If you have particular regulatory requirements, you might cryptographically sign your commits so that people can say who authored what and so on. So there's a bunch of additional stuff you can do beyond the initial tier. Licensing. This is one that people, I think, sometimes forget is very important when they're sharing research code. Under the current sort of copyright regime, the current way in which copyright tends to be organized, this is usually pretty universal because of international treaty agreements. It's not that jurisdiction dependent, but essentially you need to include a copyright notice which permits other people to use your code, or you automatically reserve all rights to it. So anyone who is using it could theoretically be sued by you for copyright infringement. So even if you have no intention of doing that, it's important to let people know on a legal basis that you have no intention of doing that. So using a license which permits people to use your code, typically for a lot of outputs of this kind, where it's a one-off analysis, permissive licenses, which basically allow people to do whatever they want with it, make the most sense. Sometimes for certain kinds of libraries, you might want to go with a copyleft license where you want to encourage people to contribute back and inhibit certain kinds of commercial activity, which might lead to proprietary stuff being built on top of an open library, but not contributing contributions back to it. Then you might go for a copyleft license, which is sort of a heritably open property. So derived works also have to be open. So there's a bunch of good advice and guidance out there about which license to choose, but there's a couple of pretty sane default ones that you can pick off the shelf, like an MIT license for the permissive license or a GPL license for a copyleft. But it is important to have one of those in your repository so people can use your code. And the checklist here looks like that. So you have a license file. Most of the Git hosting services like GitHub and GitLab will automatically recognize a file which has a name of like license in all caps and ends in a .text or .md extension, and stick that in the little like metadata associated with your project with a little short name of the license for the standard licenses, so people know what to expect. It's also important to edit license files to include the copyright holder and the date of that copyright, so that the copyright notice is valid. So, putting a license in, putting a name and a date in it, very straightforward to do. Yes, and there's other stuff you can do that can go above and beyond that. If you have a complex project, you might need to have a code included in it which has different licenses if you're using code from various other people's projects. So you might need to indicate which pieces of it are licensed in what ways, and there are tools that make it easier to do that. There's also considering licenses for any prose or documentation, which might want a different license to the software, or images, which you might want to license differently using something like the Creative Commons licenses as opposed to source code licenses like the MIT license. So there's a bunch of different stuff to consider once you get into more complicated projects for what the licensing might look like, especially if you're reusing other people's code that might have licensing conflicts with your own code. Then there's documentation, perhaps one of the most important parts. It's critical to an analysis being reproducible. It's very important to support the review of any code that you have, that other people can actually understand what it's supposed to do, what kind of inputs it expects, what kind of outputs it's going to reproduce, the environment in which it's expecting to run, what its dependencies are, where everything is located, why you've done what you've done, what the motivation was for the project in the first place, so people can sort of follow the reasoning. Yes, that's the big picture documentation, and then this is the checkbox. This is the longest set of checkboxes I have in the bronze tier for documentation, sort of all the bits for a README file. So you have to sort of tick off most of these in order to be able to tick off your bronze tier, and then say you can get suitable documentation. A few of them are kind of contingent, but it's important to provide the context. And of course, the sort of taking it to the extreme version of the documentation might be having the entire manuscript of your paper generated from the well-documented reproducible source code. So you run one command, it does all your data analyses, spits out all your figures, spits out your paper, and shows you the result. And all the intermediate stuff is also well documented. So there's various different degrees to which you can take that. Making work citable. This is another big one that is important to do. Credit for the analysis portion of a particular paper or for the development of a particular piece of software is useful to give to the primary person who was responsible for that aspect of the work. It's helpful to be able to cite that as a separate item from the paper. And you can provide the citational metadata in a code repository using a standardized format called a citation.cff file. It's a YAML file for those familiar with configuration languages. And there's a nice, simple graphical in-browser editor that you can go to generate citation.cff files if you don't want to write them yourself manually. And there's a couple of validation tools out there to check their syntax is correct. But that lets you put in things like author names, their ORCIDs, their affiliations, and so on. And then it can be used to generate standard citational format information by citation managers like Zotero and so on. So you can include a persistent identifier for the software repository as well. This is a very useful thing to have. So an important thing to remember about Git hosting platforms like GitLab and GitHub is they're not archival storage locations for your source code. They have no guarantees about long-term storage. So it's important to mint persistent identifiers for your source code using something like Zenodo or Software Heritage, who do have long-term preservation guarantees. In the case of Zenodo, it's just a snapshot of a point in time, whereas Software Heritage archives the entire repository. So making sure that you generate a persistent identifier for your source code means that it's possible for someone to go and retrieve that, even if GitHub, for some reason, or GitLab, or whomever else you're using to host it, goes away. There's always a way back to the source code. So this is what a checklist looks like, including your citation.cff file, making sure you have a persistent identifier. The other thing is crediting contributions, so giving people the appropriate credit roles, and there's a bunch of other versions of credit for taxonomies of different role contributions that you can use if credit doesn't capture the contributions that people have made to the project. Identifying people with their ORCIDs, identifying people's institutions with their RORIDs. So there's a nice persistent way of referring to all of those affiliations and individuals and role descriptors, etc. Peer review and code review. So how can you get sort of a third-party endorsement that your code meets certain criteria? In the case of the simplest tier of this is just giving your code to someone else and seeing if they can run it, even if it's in an unofficial capacity, as it were. It's just, can someone else, even someone else within your own research group, actually run your code and get the same result? It's often a higher bar than you might expect. And it's a good test of your documentation and instructions that someone else can rerun your work. For some slightly more formal external validation, you have things like CodeCheck and ReproHack, who will check that they are able to rerun your analysis. They won't check for the correctness of the analysis, but they will check if you've provided enough detail that they can narrowly reproduce the result, as it were. If you are looking for a more complete, more academic style peer review process for your code, then this is harder for one-off analyses, although in theory a peer reviewer should be performing some of that task if they're reviewing a paper which has important computational results. But there's for software packages, projects like ROpenSci and PyOpenSci and the Journal of Open Source Software, who have formal review processes for software packages that are both for code quality and for sort of an academic style peer review. So yes, that's the checklist for peer review code review, and the bar is initially quite low there, but just getting someone else to run the code, and then ramps up to having some more formal attestations to the correctness of the work. And environment management portability. So, how can people get the software that you have running on your system running on their system, and how can they run your script and use the data that's in your project on their systems? So, ideally, when it comes to dependency management to the software that they will need to run your code, this would be in an automated format, because you can supply a manual set of lists of software of given versions to install, but that can be a very lengthy process to do, especially once you start accommodating things like transitive dependencies. That's a long list of software. So if possible, to capture the environment, you can use an automated tool like the various language-specific package managers have things like log files where it makes a list of all the, say, R package you have installed, something like renv. But then you've got the problem of the system dependencies of the specific tools that are written in a given language. So, your R XML package might need a C library, which does XML processing more quickly. So you need to have that installed for the R package to be installed, but your language-specific package manager is only going to manage the R dependencies, not necessarily the C dependencies. If you also need to have a way of installing that other dependency, and that can get complicated quickly. So using containers, virtual machine images, or functional package management tools like Nix or Geeks gives you that more complete description, even if there's differences in kind there. Like a container or a virtual machine, for example, is still fundamentally a sort of imperative process. It's still using a conventional package manager, so it doesn't necessarily capture the exact versions of everything that we used and what their transitive dependencies are. Things like Nix and Geeks functional package managers do effectively capture the entire dependency tree. So they're kind of a different kind and slightly better in that regard, but still in some ways less practical, as they're a bit less mature as technologies than containers. And then you've got more simple stuff like the no hard-coded paths. Right? It's very common and a source of, according to several analyses, of the ability to rerun various deposited code bases to find hard-coded paths that are pointing to something on the specific system where that data is stored. So, your home directory on a Linux system, home/your username, that's going to be different once someone's copied this code onto their other project. They're not going to have a home/your username directory. It's going to be in a home/their username directory. So it won't be able to find the file. So making sure you're using relative paths where the relative is relative to your project's directory. The project you're giving someone else, this directory is the place which that file should be relative to. And if data files are expected to be there, even if they're not included in the code base, then you need to have instructions for where to get those data files from and where they're expected to be by your scripts. So, if sample1.csv is a massive CSV file, maybe you've deposited it somewhere like Zenodo or Figshare, where they can accommodate several gigabytes worth of data, but you don't want to put that in a Git history. So you need a way of making sure that a file that contains the right information ends up in the data folder and has the correct name when you run the script. So, a script that actually pulls it from the same resource where you deposited it might be a way of approaching that, for example. The checklist here has some different steps you can take for capturing the computational environment. The sort of lowest hanging fruit version of that for something like R is the session info command that gives you the currently loaded packages. And renv gives you a more complete version of that, but it still doesn't accommodate the system dependencies, as I mentioned before. So this is just sort of the tiers of of complexity you can follow there for completeness of description of a computational environment. And I think lastly from the examples is governance, conduct, and continuity, which is just how can you keep your project being a good place to collaborate if you're actually collaborating with other people on it. But the continuity part is often quite important for one often has these in particular research labs. Where does that code live when you leave the lab? Can your lab mates still get to it? Can they make edits to it? Can they make updates to it? If someone comes in with an error that they've reported that they found in the script, can they patch it? Or is it sat in your personal repository and you're off doing something else and don't have time to deal with it now? So there's a question of can people pick up where they left off? So, what's the process look like? What are your lab's SOPs for where people should keep their code? Who should have permission to access it and edit it, and so on and so forth. This can often take the form of a GitHub organization or a GitLab group with different roles for people where, you may have a senior scientist or a senior postdoc or just the PI in the lab who has some kind of admin role who can add people who are coming in and doing bioinformatics stuff and make sure that their projects are under that umbrella. So if they leave, people can still update the code and can still share it around. And then, conduct with regards to things like codes of conduct, rules for how to converse in shared project spaces and so on, and who's responsible for enforcing those rules. This is what the checklist looks like. It's largely just sort of clearly communicating what your governance model is, what your SOPs are. It's quite varied depending on the particular nature of the project you're working on. Other thing, of course, is making sure that you have copies of the project. So, if your admin for some reason is banned from GitHub, which does occasionally happen, does someone have? Is there someone else who has the right permissions to change stuff? Do you have archives of your source repositories on other platforms? Have you set up a mirroring action between one of your Git repositories and another Git host? Yes, those sorts of things. And so all those components of the checklist are sort of organized into a little bit of a points and medal system to try and make it a little bit of a, I don't know, maybe I can sort of nerd snipe a couple people into trying to tick off these boxes is the idea, make it a bit of a competition. So you've got badges for each of the categories, and then when you tick off the checkboxes at different tiers, you get different medals, with the idea being that you should sort of pass a minimum threshold. So if you want the overall bronze medal, you have to get bronze across all the categories. But beyond that, it's just the rounded down mean of the overall score divided by the number of categories. So your medal for silver, gold, and platinum is just the average of your score. So you can do well elsewhere, even if you're still a little closer to the bronze end on other points. And the idea here also is that in theory, you can get someone else externally to attest to this. So this can be a self-assessed system, or someone else can look at your code base, score you on the checklist, and then there's a different colored badge for an external rating. And then the way in which you do that is you'd have them make a commit to your repository. So have so that their identity, ideally a signed commit, so they can say, "Yep, I'm attesting that this score on this checklist was made by me." So the sort of workflow that I would envisage, as I mentioned when I described this as just a text file, is as you make the changes to your project, which tick off particular boxes, you change them. So if you've got the checklist file that has a include a README option. So you change from an unchecked to a checked README box, and you've added this information to your README. And there's a couple of examples of that in existing projects that so what that would look like. For example, this is a project that I helped out on with adding documentation to. These are the steps that we take those boxes off for the documentation. This is the documentation change. So they're in the same point in the history. You can see which changes meant ticking which boxes. Okay, and these slides are available as a resource. The website for the checklists is here. There's a little tool for generating the checklist badges, which takes a moment to load, but once it's done. So yeah, if you want to use these checklists, if you want to find out more about them, the website is there, rsspdc.org. Yeah, I will stop the recording and open the floor to any questions that people have in the live session. Thank you very much.